What's up everyone, Darcblade here with a hunter's guide to how I create mixed set builds in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. This is a little bit of a behind the scenes regarding the thought process behind the builds featured on the channel. Now when it comes to using armour and builds in Monster Hunter World Iceborne, there is no wrong or right answer. You can use pretty much whatever you like, it's entirely down to you. But I wanted to share the process I go through when creating the various builds I use. Now some people out there will create their builds entirely on stats, different skills, looks, or builds made out of entirely full sets, and all of these are fine. But for me, I normally create the builds focusing on one of the various metas, which I've described in a previous video, which you can find down in the description below, or it should be in the cards up above. To me, there isn't just one meta, there are multiple metas or different styles, so I tend to create builds focused on one of these aspects. Now, the process behind this could be seen as a little bit of a flow chart. So to start off, when you're creating a build, you have to decide what weapon you are going to use. This is the starting point. For some players this is easy because they only specialise in one weapon. For others who specialise in multiple weapons, you may want to consider what monster you want to take on or what specific task you want to complete. Certain monsters, ones that stay airborne for longer periods, for example like Kushala Daora, Azure Rathalos or Silver Rathalos, you may want to consider taking ranged weapons, while smaller sized monsters like Dogoron, Tobikudachi, the Fanged Wyverns and such, making use of weapons that have shorter ranges but high damage output could be optimal, like dual blades or sword and shield. Also, when it comes to picking a weapon, you'll also have to take into consideration weapon aspects such as its elemental type, affinity rating, sharpness, attack and more. But regardless, once you've got the weapon you want to make a build for, it's time to move on to the next step, which is choosing a theme or role for the build. Now like I said, I see the meta of Monster Hunter World slightly differently, as it could be divided into different roles and themes, and this applies to your build. Ultimately, this is where you're going to decide if your build is a DPS build, survival build, defensive build, support build, utility build, so on and so forth. Once you've decided what you're going to go for with your build, it's time to move on to the next step, which is picking a set bonus. Now, when it comes to skills in Monster Hunter World Iceborne, set bonuses are very powerful skills, but you can only obtain them by wearing certain pieces of an armor set. So deciding on if you want a set bonus for your build is a good starting point before you actually start selecting armor pieces and decorations. So hypothetically, say if you are going for a DPS build, and you're using a melee weapon, you may want to go for Master's Touch. This means that you are restricted to using 3 pieces of the Teostra set. Say if you're going for a survival build, you may want to utilise Super Recovery or Hasten Recovery, and thus you need to use pieces of the Black Veil Valhazak and Ruina Nergigante armour sets. Regardless, picking a set bonus is a good starting point after you've selected your weapon and the theme of your build. But at the end of the day, it's down to you. You don't have to use a set bonus at all if you don't want to, as you can create powerful builds without actually making use of them. But anyway, once you have your set bonus down, it's time to move on to the next step, which is filling out and picking the remaining pieces of armour and what skills you want to focus on. Now, after you have your set bonus, or if you're not going for a set bonus at all, choosing your armour is the next step, but you also have to consider what skills are found on these armour pieces. If you're going for a DPS build, whether it be high raw, high affinity or high elemental attack, you may want to consider armor pieces that complement or max out skills that are related to these DPS aspects. If you're going for defensive builds, taking armor pieces that utilize health boost, divine protection and such may be preferable. So use this point to fill in the gaps and complement your set bonus or the overall theme and role of the build you're trying to create. Which brings us on to the next section, which is decorations and charms. Now this section is kind of filling in the gaps of your build. You've chosen your weapon as well as the associated set bonuses and armor, and now it's time to max out the skills you have via decorations and your charms. Certain weapons in Monster Hunter World Iceborne definitely require some specific decorations, which are achieved in this section of the build process. For example, if you're using the bow, using the Mighty Bow Jaw is definitely required, as it provides you the Bow Charge Plus skill, which isn't really found on a lot of armor pieces bar the Legiana set bonuses. So utilising decorations that are must-haves for the various weapons in the game comes into play and is a priority during this section. Afterwards though, like I said, it's a case of just filling in the gaps, maxing out the skills you want or adding the skills that you require via the various jaws you have, and if you don't have the jaws, you can always make use of the charm. So once you've finished socketing jaws and you've chosen the charm you want to use, it's time to move on to the next section, which is a little bit of an investment, which is augmenting the weapon you're using as well as upgrading the armour you're using. Now this obviously takes some resources, and some players may want to skip this phase in favour of the next phase, as it does require materials. Personally, what I tend to do is not fully augment a weapon, instead normally go for a health regen or affinity increase, and then go on to the next phase. I understand not everyone has access to a lot of materials and can easily throw them away on just testing out builds. So this phase of the build process could be skipped out for some players out there. Which brings us on to the next phase, which is the test hunts. Now once you've got a build ready, it's time to test it out. Now you can do this in multiple ways. If you're looking for pure damage numbers, you can test out the build in the training area, but I always find it preferable to test them out on hunts. Normally I go for tier 2 tempered monsters, as these provide a big enough challenge whilst at the same time not being exceedingly difficult, so it gives you a good idea of what the build is capable of, both in terms of defense, offense and more. Now just one hunt may not be enough to test a build, as you may be unlucky, so doing multiple test hunts is advisable. It also gives you an opportunity to see if you are missing anything from your build. Hypothetically, say you're using the greatsword, you've got a build ready to go, you go on a test hunt and then you realise you're missing the focus skill, it's time to go back to the drawing boards. Regardless, the test hunts are kind of essential to seeing if the build works for you, and if it doesn't, you go back a few steps and you repeat the process, swapping out either the charm and the jewels. If that still doesn't fix things, you could go back even further and swap out armor pieces, and if that doesn't fix things, you can go back even further to the set bonus. So as you can see, the build process I use has a nice flow to it. Ultimately though, once you finish the test hunts and you're happy with the build, you've got to the final stage, which is the finished, final and completed build, to which you can make it look a little bit more pretty by using layered armor, charms and more. And that is pretty much how I go about building my builds in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. As you can see, it is a little bit of a flowchart. You can see it on screen here, how it all works and how they all flow into one another. Using this process is normally how I go about creating interesting and unique builds. Most of you know that I don't stick or adhere to a one meta build only, which for me spices up the game and keeps things interesting. So if you're looking to create your own builds, I hope you may take this little flowchart into account. And until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you a hunter's guide about how I create mixed set builds in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.